Okay, so welcome to the SafeShark and DSIT webinar for this afternoon, Connected Device Compliance. We're going to have an enforcement update from OPSS and some information about the new legislation for cybersecurity from DSIT. So I'll go through a little bit about who we are at SafeShark and then introduce the speakers, and then we'll go into the content and explain a bit about a bit more about your opportunities to participate as well on the call. So if we go through a little bit about SafeShark to begin with. So we are PSTI and RED compliance specialists. PSTI being the new legislation for cybersecurity, which we're going to hear about today. RED being the Radio Equipment Directive, which is going to be coming in force in Europe from next year. And each of these have cybersecurity requirements in for consumer IoT devices. So we was helped with some small amount of government money early in 2021, and we set up a test lab and testing platform for consumer IoT cybersecurity testing. So overall, we provide quick and simple compliance testing, and we combine the UK and EU market access requirements. So allowing you to sell your product into the UK and EU market, prepare for those requirements that are coming in, and of course, protect your competitive position. So that's a little bit about SafeShark. We've got some customers on board already. We've got some testimonials there, which you'll be able to see. I think the key thing there is that we've got the expertise and the knowledge to help you kind of ask the questions that you need to know about your product in particular. So you can see there the gain trust from our expertise in the standards. We sit on the standards bodies writing these specifications, so we know exactly what you've got to do. I guess a key element of what we also do is we provide ongoing monitoring. So cybersecurity is a kind of ever-evolving requirement, and obviously your product goes through software iterations. And what our testing does is it takes that into account and gives you a kind of ongoing compliance service with quarterly reports and information about the legislation and things like that. So that's some information from our customers. Speakers today, we've got a great panel of speakers from within UK government and the Office of Product Safety and Standards. So there's myself, I'm Alex Buchan, I'm a director at SafeShark. And we've got Veena Dhaliwal, who's head of enforcement and evidence at DSIT. We've got Jonathan Angwin, head of product security legislation at DSIT. And Maria, who's head of product security legislation at DSIT also. Warda, who's the Senior Enforcement Policy Advisor at DSIT, you can see on the screen there. And Jackie White, who's the Enforcement Manager for Product Regulation at OPSS. So you'll be hearing from all of these speakers today. A few kind of ground rules. We're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So we'll hear from all of the speakers and then we'll open up to the floor for questions. I would say that the questions will need to be tailored around the enforcement and the legislation itself and clauses within the legislation. We can't take any product-specific questions, and really that's not in the remit of the speakers here. So in general, the legislation is designed to be non-restrictive, give you scope to kind of tailor your processes within your business. So we can't be taking questions about this product and that product and particular functionality. And if anything, we've only got an hour, so we wouldn't have much time to deal with those anyway. I'd say if you do have questions of that nature regarding your product and specifics around that and your functionality, we're happy to help at SafeShark. Same with retailers as well. If you've got questions about the requirements and when they're enforced and how it affects particular aspects of your product, then that is where we can come in at SafeShark and give you some further information on that. And we're quite happy to provide guidance and information on that. And also there's guidance that's been provided through the standards bodies that we're in, so we can point you in the direction of those things as well. So that's enough from me anyway. So I'll hand over to our speakers. First off, we've got Veena, who's going to be introducing the work DSIT are doing and the PSTI bill, and then we'll take it from there. So Veena, over to you, and I think you're going to share your screen here.
Right, I'm just sharing the screen now. Let me know if you can see.
Yeah, we can see it's not in presentation mode at the moment.
It's not yet, but it will be when I click it. Hold on one moment. Great, there we go. Yes. So lovely. Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be joining you and making some time to speak to you directly and answer some of your questions. Over the last few conversations and webinars we've had, we've kind of realised that there's a scale of awareness as part of this legislation. There are those who've been involved right from the very start, and those who are kind of coming at it a little bit newer. So we know with DTG, many of the organisation on this call will be kind of well informed and have been engaging with us over a few years, but we're going to go through a little bit of what we can talk about today, a little bit of background, and then go into enforcement. So the kind of some of the key messages we'd like you to leave with today are to kind of review the existing resources that we have, because there's a lot of information that you'll find really helpful within those documents. So we wanted to highlight the PSTI Act and the regulations 2023, and that's where you'll find kind of information on the obligations on manufacturers, information on the security requirements, the statement of compliance, and the contents of the statement of compliance, as well as kind of lots of helpful information. We've been sharing the ETSI standards themselves, as well as the implementation plan, guide, the technical specification, and the assessment specification. That's got lots of practical information in terms of how one might comply with the standard. That should be read alongside the regulations, so you can ensure that you're meeting the requirements of the regulation and anything that's additional to what is in the standard. So what we're going to be sharing with you in kind of the coming weeks is a landing page, which will be on OPSS's website, the OPSS enforcement guidance, and we'll also be putting out some non-statutory signposting guidance. So this isn't anything that you need in order to comply, because the majority of the information, all the information is in the legislation and the regulations themselves. But this will help as a signposting tool to help kind of understand where particular piece of information are, a little bit on interpretation, and we'll share as much as we can to help. What we can't do is provide any legally binding advice, as we're not authorised to do that. We can't provide technical advice, because that's best left to your technical teams who'll have kind of a better knowledge of your processes and your products and your software. We can't provide detailed interpretation of legislation or anything that would kind of certify, anything that would constitute certification, verification, or assurance. So that's just to manage expectations and just share with you what we can go through today. And then suggested next steps is to familiarise yourselves with the legislation and existing resources. Would really encourage that you engage with your legal experts and technical experts, including, for example, your heads of compliance and heads of security, and also work with wider supply chains to kind of incorporate compliance into future contracts. Start thinking about that now, and also kind of thinking about how you're working with your retailers. So this morning we had a conversation with a number of retailers who are looking at this specifically from kind of a distributor and retailer point of view, and they raised some really interesting points. So I know here we're going to have a selection of organisations who fulfil both roles. So part of that would be kind of where you're working in one role, make sure you're talking to others in your supply chains. A quick overview of the regime. This is the first in the world, first regime in the world to require minimum cybersecurity requirements for consumer IoT products within the UK. That the Act received royal assent last year in December, and the regulations were laid in Parliament this year and approved in September this year. We'll go into a bit more detail about that and the timescales, because we have had a few questions on commencement. So if those questions come up, we'll be happy to answer. And then a key diagram to direct your attention to is the content of the Act and also content of the regulations. So the Act is where you'll find the scope definitions of who's in scope and what is in scope, the duties to comply split by manufacturer, importer, and distributor. To relieve the other duties, the enforcement powers and the delegated powers. Within the regulations, you'll find the scope exceptions, details of the 3 security requirements themselves and the deemed compliance, as well as more detail on the statement of compliance, the retention requirements, and also the content of that statement of compliance itself. We've got some information here that we want to share with you on deemed compliance to kind of set out what is in the legislation and how it kind of compares to what is in the ETSI standards. So each of the security requirements set out in our 2003 regulations broadly aligns with the provisions in the ETSI EN 303645. However, with the security requirements, we need to add a bit more clarity for consumers and the supply chain. So there are some slight differences to be aware of. So we've kind of set out what those are within that that table, so you can kind of compare the two. Right, so moving on to enforcement, which I know is why a lot of you have joined us here today. I'll be passing over to Jackie to talk about enforcement, which we carried out by OPSS. Right, over to you, Jackie. I'm happy to move the slides along if you just say next to save you uploading.
Thank you. Okay, so as been said, that the Office of Product Safety and Standards, OPSS, is the Secretary of State's chosen enforcing authority for Part 1 of the PSTI Act. So we will be enforcing from the 29th of April next year. We're wanting to support businesses to comply, but we will be investigating and monitoring and taking robust action where we are aware of non-compliances. Obviously in line with our enforcement policy. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit about our approach so far. So OPSS has been the enforcing authority, and DSIT as the policy owners have a shared ambition that enforcement is to be delivered in a robust, proportionate and risk-based manner. And we will look to take action against those businesses that do fail to comply with their obligations. So our approach will focus on supporting industry. So we want to support industry through compliance through guidance, raising awareness and capability, rather than just going straight to punitive measures. So we want to work with businesses, certainly in the first instance. And DSIT and OPSS are always working together, so we're not separate. We are working together. We are both aligned in how we want to enforce the PSTI regulations. And enforcement will be risk-based and proportionate, as I already said, with a focus on supporting industry compliance. So OPSS, I think we've already enforced a number of pieces of legislation on behalf of other government departments, so eco-design, energy labelling, ROS, batteries, those types of legislation. So we're already a trusted regulator. We'll be working with the PSTI regulations exactly the same as we do with all of those other pieces of legislation, and that is that we'll be working within the remit of our enforcement policy, which is already published, within our service standards, and also in line with the regulators code, which sets out those principles. So the OPSS principles are that all enforcement action will be targeted, it will be proportionate, consistent, transparent and accountable. Next slide, please. So in terms of our specific approach to PSTI, we will be looking to identify areas of non-compliance. So that will be through conducting our own market surveillance, and it will be through receiving business inquiries, concerns, all external routes. So that might be businesses like yourselves that are aware of non-compliances in the marketplace. It might be through different sort of hackers, different organisations, consumer groups. So we'll be receiving lots of intelligence, and with that intelligence, what we'll look to do is perform some testing on products. we'll be doing desk-based inspections, and we'll be doing business engagement. In terms of specifically addressing those non-compliances, what we'll be doing is looking at what awareness of requirements is out there and adding to that. So this is sort of one of those first steps. So in the build up to the implementation, we'll be helping with interpretation of requirements. We'll be looking at the intention to comply. So we're wanting all businesses obviously to comply and to make them aware that they've got to comply by the 29th of April. We're looking at the compliance measures that are in place. So in terms of compliance measures, we've got a number of powers afforded to ourselves within the Act and regulations. So examples of those is compliance notices, which we can serve. We can serve stop notices to prohibit further action from taking place. We can serve recall notices, so requiring action to be taken to arrange returns of specific products that are non-compliant. We can impose monetary penalties. So monetary penalties which we can impose can be up to a limit of £10 million or 4% of worldwide turnover, whichever is the greater. So quite stringent and quite high level monetary penalties that are afforded within the legislation. And we can also apply for forfeiture to a court as well, a product. So a wide range of measures that we'll be taking, as I've said, in line with our enforcement policy and the regulators code. And overarchingly, we'll be monitoring the compliance measures which we put in place as well. So to ensure that compliance is improving. So that's just a brief overview of the approach. Happy to answer more questions, but I'll pass back to Vina just to start looking at those questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jackie. Right, so we're going to move over to the questions that you've sent to us previously, and I'm going to share our answers with you. So just so you know who's going to be feeding in, it will be myself and Maude on the kind of DSTI, the DSIT enforcement side, Jackie from OPSS, and then Jonathan and Maria from the legislation side of DSIT. Also, I just wanted to mention, if it does get too noisy and you can't hear, please can someone just flag and we will take measures accordingly. So one of the first questions on our list was in terms of the statement of compliance and what that might include. So as per the legislation, a statement of compliance is a document that is prepared by or on behalf of the manufacturer of the product. It states that in the opinion of the manufacturer, they have complied with the applicable security requirements. There's information that kind of details high-level information on the statement of compliance within the Act itself. That can be found in Section 9 under subsection 3. So it's got details of the definition of the statement of compliance. Schedule 4 of the PSTI regulations gives you more information of the content of that statement of compliance and what it should include. So please do turn your attention to that document because it will give you all the information that will need to be included. We've listed it all there just so people get an idea of the types of information that needs to be within that document. We have had questions asking whether an online version is sufficient, but as per the wording of the legislation, the statement of compliance must accompany the product at every stage of its journey through the supply chain. So this means it must accompany the product from the point at which it is made available through to the customer. Online versions of the statement of compliance do not fulfill this obligation, and the legislation, just one point to make in addition to support that, is the legislation does not prescribe that the statement of compliance must be in the box. So with all of these questions and the kind of scope with which we're answering them as per what is included within the legislation and the Act and the regulation themselves. Any kind of language, unless it's specifically defined within the regulations, it will just refer to kind of standard dictionary test or common understanding. So before we move on, are there any questions around this particular? No? Okay. Oh, we do have a hand up. Let me just see who that is. Right, so we've got David and Sean. So David, do you want to go first? Actually, we'll take them both and we'll answer them together.
Yeah, I'm not sure who's going to be able to get their mic off, but yeah, there's a Q&A. So unless you can try, David, but I think yeah, your mic is it's a webinar, yeah. So the Q&A box at the top there, if you submit your question in there, we'll come down to that and go through it that way. So there's some particular questions around the statement of compliance. Then there was one around vehicles, which Jonathan was going to go. So maybe if we deal with the statement of compliance one, since you're just talking about that now. So we've got Christian first. So those statements seem to be in conflict. If it's not required to be in the box but not allowed to be available online, what is the acceptable solution?
Can I come in on that point very quickly?
Yeah, sure, Jonathan. Yeah, go for it.
Alex. So the two factors that have been mentioned there. So, I mean, firstly, I would say nothing in our regime prescribes the provision of a digital document that contains the information set out in Schedule 4 of the regulations. We also don't explicitly prescribe in the actual drafting of the legislation that online versions of the statement of compliance are not permissible. I think when we have had this question posed to us before, for instance, people suggesting that a QR code might be a suitable solution for the statement of compliance. What we have pointed out is that the legislation makes clear that the statement of compliance has to be a document that accompanies the product with the information set out in Schedule 4 of the regulations. If what accompanies the product is merely a link to that information that is set out somewhere else, that is not information that is accompanying the product. So our suggestion is that that as a hypothetical means of satisfying the statement of compliance duties would be unlikely to meet those duties within the Act. What I would say on this point more generally is the factors that we have set out, the way in which our statement of compliance duties have been designed, has deliberately been designed to mirror, in instances where it's acceptable, almost word for word, the way in which the EU Declaration of Conformity or Summary Declaration of Conformity provisions in relation to, for example, radio equipment work under legislation that any manufacturer of a consumer connectable product will likely already be subject to. So if you have queries or concerns about the way in which the way that you plan to comply with the statement of compliance duties is likely to be compliant, a first port of call would probably be talking to your legal counsel about whether exactly what you do in terms of making sure the summary EU Declaration of Conformity accompanies the product would work for the statement of compliance.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so I think that answers Peter's question as well, because would it be acceptable to use a QR code or reference in the statement of compliance URL? So you talked to that already. I can't see any questions on the statement of compliance other than the ones you've already answered around QR codes. I'll just go back to the first question, which was around vehicles. I know we didn't want to get too much down, well, we don't want to cover product specifics. You mentioned though, Jonathan, that you could maybe cover something on that. So I don't know whether you want to answer that question from Cindy.
No, absolutely. So automotive vehicles are products that the government signalled its intent to not be included within the scope of the regime when it comes into effect. Automotive vehicles are not expressly listed as a accepted product in Schedule 2 of the regulations. However, for those interested in the minutiae of UK politics, if you look at the Hansard debates for the passage of the PSTI secondary legislation, specifically the Commons debate, you'll see that our government minister has confirmed that we intend to bring forward additional legislation that will make sure that automotive vehicles are accepted from the regime at the point at which it comes into effect. So the kind of too long didn't read on that point is that we intend for automotive vehicles to be accepted from the regime when it comes into effect.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so can I just remind everyone, questions in the Q&A there. You can see the Q&A button at the top, just so I'm not trying to go between the chat and the questions. So I'll take them in order. The next one is actually just check with one thing with you, Vina. You had some pre-asked questions already, so did you want to cover them?
Shall I? Well, yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll go through what's already in the slides, because I don't think there are many, and then we can focus on some of the questions in the chat, because we might actually cover some of them off.
Okay.
So that will save people
Yeah,
from
so it's-
typing if they don't need to.
Perfect.
Right, so on to the next question that we had. Hold on, let me just check I haven't missed anything. Right, so we had a question about product exceptions, and I know that Jonathan has already covered off vehicles. So the products that are in scope are internet connectable products and network connectable products. These are products capable of both sending and receiving data by means of a transmission involving electrical or electromagnetic energy. It's products that are capable of connecting directly to an internet connectable product by means of a communication protocol that forms part of the Internet Protocol Suite, or a product that meets the second condition if it is capable of connecting directly to 2 or more products at the same time via a communication protocol that does not form part of the Internet Protocol Suite, and is capable of connecting directly to an internet connectable product by means of such a communication protocol, whether or not at the same time as it connects to any other product. So I'm sorry, that was a mouthful. There's further detail within the Act and the regulations, which can give you more information to kind of work through each of the kind of conditions and requirements. The products that are not in scope include exceptions such as smart charge points, smart meters, medical devices, and laptops and computers. So these products are out of scope as they're already legislated, or they will soon be legislated. So we don't want to double regulate, and we've also exempted some of these products because they may already have a good level of security. So that's the information on kind of what is in scope and what's out of scope, where the exceptions are. I would strongly recommend looking at the Act itself to look at kind of what would determine an organisation to be in scope, and also what would determine a product to be in scope in terms of if it's going to be a product that is going to be supplied to consumers within the UK. And as Jonathan said, please do share that with your legal teams and in conjunction with your technical teams, because they will be able to help you work through that and interpret the law. Now we have a question on PC peripherals being excluded from the PSTI when intended to be connected only to desktop and laptop computers. Can I bring you in to help with that one, Jonathan, or would you like to come back to it at the end?
Yeah, sure, super quickly. So our conventional IT exceptions, so our exceptions for desktop computers, laptop computers, and non-cellular tablet computers, they accept products that are those computers. There is no exception for products that are associated, for example, with a desktop computer, but are not themselves a desktop computer. Those exceptions only refer to the things that are described in those exceptions as accepted products. So the computers.
Thank you. So the short answer is the exceptions are just those included within that statement of compliance. Right. And we've got questions here on deemed compliance, which links to one of the slides that we had earlier on in the presentation. What conditions need to be met for deemed compliance? So deemed compliance can only be achieved where a manufacturer meets the conditions set out in all parts of Schedule 2 of the 2023 regulations for all 3 of the security requirements. If this is not possible, then a manufacturer must comply with Schedule 1. So the government has not mandated third-party testing at this time. So whilst this might change in future, it is important to note that any organisation that seeks to undertake third-party testing must carry out their own due diligence when doing so. So with all of that, I think what we want to all the point we want to get across is that the security requirements are included within the regulations. Where there are conditions for deemed compliance, that is also specified within the regulations themselves. As part of that, the manufacturer can kind of demonstrate their compliance in a number of ways. They can either kind of self-declare and say we're confident through our testing or through our own processes and procedures. We can demonstrate and we can declare that our products comply. There's other forms of kind of testing and assurance out there. We haven't actually mandated anything at this time to provide like a specific requirement for kind of making that determination. That is down to individual organisations. The reason that we've done that is because we didn't want to mandate a particular process that will potentially cost money. There may not be enough organisations in the market available to provide that service within a certain timescale. So we've left it up to the organisations to determine how and how they'd like to kind of demonstrate their compliance, whether it's through self-declaration, third-party testing, assessment. Right, so those are all the questions that we have been sent in advance. Oh, I've just seen that Maria's put her hand up. Maria.
Thanks, Nina. I just wanted to come in to clarify that it's possible for a manufacturer to comply with, to be deemed compliant with individual security requirements. It's not necessary to comply with all deemed compliance conditions set out in Schedule 2. It's indeed possible to comply with some of them and be deemed compliant with each individual security requirement as set out in Schedule 2.
Thanks, Maria.
Great. Okay. Right. Well, we'll go back to the questions we've got in the chat at the moment. So next one was from Steve Hayes. Will DSIT be doing any awareness campaigns on this legislation? I mean, obviously that's what this is about as well. But from my experience, there is very little known about this by manufacturers, and so far, FYI, the EMC Test Labs Association polled its members recently, and most were completely unaware.
Okay, so yep, that is a challenge that we're facing, and it's something we've been kind of trying to tackle over the years. Through speaking to our kind of key stakeholders, organisations such as yourselves who have many members associated to kind of spread that word. We're running a number of webinars such as this at the moment with various kind of trade and membership organisations to get the word out there. We have various newsletters that we encourage people to sign up to. We'll be speaking with kind of some of our trusted stakeholders to help share this message on social media in order to raise awareness. But part of the awareness raising is kind of talking to various organisations through webinars, speaking at events, and we're looking at kind of what we can do to fill any gap in terms of organisations who still are not aware. One thing which might be worth mentioning is that we're looking to do some kind of research within industry where we're speaking to as many manufacturers of IoT equipment in the UK in the coming months, and that will be another way to kind of reach people. But I think this isn't an ask for us to share this information, share information on the PSTI. I think what we're also hearing is that people are aware of PSTI but thinking that it doesn't apply to them. So this is something that we would encourage as well. That might be part of the challenge. So encouraging people just to look at the scope, look at the products that they're producing, look at the customers that they're selling to, and also seeing like where they fit into that in terms of the connectivity of their products to kind of determine whether that applies. But short answer, yes, we're looking at running these kind of webinar roadshows that we've been doing for the last month and a half, and also looking at kind of other ways to share this information.
Cool, great. Jonathan, you got your hand up? I'm just going to share my screen as well.
Thanks, Alex. So I just wanted to come in really quickly on this question. So as Vina set out, absolutely, we are going to be continuing the work that we have been doing to raise awareness of the regime not least because the government wants to, as much as possible, work with industry to ensure that the regime is effective in protecting consumers from inadequately secured products, but also minimizing industry burden. I just wanted to make the point, though, that the government's efforts to raise awareness of the regime are not mutually exclusive with the responsibility that any business operating in a market has to make sure that it is aware of the rules that that market is implementing for the operation in that market. So for absolute clarity, it is not going to be considered a carve-out for potential enforcement action if a manufacturer has failed to comply because they didn't attend one of these webinars.
Yeah, as you can see on the screen there, we've written a guide as well. You can download that, so that might help. You can share that with your members or your, you said you polled, so could be something useful there. Peter, I saw you had your hand up, but if you put comments in the Q&A, we'll get to that. Next question was on the, that was QR codes again. We covered that one. Jonathan mentioned that before. Another one about statement of compliance. Does it require the batch? Or is ENR will be enough? I'm not sure what ENR does. It require the batch? So on the product information and the statement of compliance, what kind of level of detail do you have to go down to, I guess? Is that something we can cover in this? Yeah, go on, Jonathan.
I mean, we can only say about what our intentions are for the statement of compliance, the information it contains, what we've said that information should be interpreted as, in line with what we've published in the text of the regulation itself. We can't really comment on whether a specific solution in a specific scenario is going to be compliant or not. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Next one from S. McHugh. Explanatory guidance from UK Gov says a statement of compliance or B, a summary statement is fine. What is the summary you would accept? Can we use the summary used for RED with a link?
So the reference I made earlier to there being parallels between the way that the statement of compliance provisions in our regime works and the way that the EU Declaration of Conformity, Summary Declaration of Conformity provisions work within broader product safety legislation was only in relation to the manner in which the provisions about how the document is accompanying the product works. We have not published within our regulations there being any provision about there being an option for a summary statement of compliance. We have a power to be able to do that at some point in the future. That was a future-proofing measure that wasn't intended to be acted on in this version of the regime. The statement of compliance needs to be a document that accompanies the product that contains the information in Schedule 4 of the regulations.
Okay, great. So it's very clear. Go online, check the regulation, check Schedule 4, follow that. Can the statement be put on a screen if an electronic user manual if the product has a screen, so like I said, TV or whatever the case is? You mentioned it had to come with the product, Jonathan. Does that count as coming with the product?
It's the same answer I have to give to this one as well. It has to be a document prepared by or on behalf of the manufacturer that accompanies the product that contains the information in Schedule 4 of the regulations.
Okay.
But questions about whether your specific plans for meeting those obligations align with that, that's something for you to ask to your legal counsel. It's not for government to say.
Okay. So, so that goes for any other questions on that kind of side of things at the moment. Michael Darby has asked, would it be acceptable for a manufacturer to write their UKCA doc and their PSTI doc on the same document or even on an EU doc? So a declaration of conformity. So I guess combining everything into a single statement.
So there are no provisions within our regime that say that the statement of compliance document has to only contain the information set out in Schedule 4 of the regulations. So I would suggest that my personal opinion reading that wouldn't rule out that information also being featured alongside other information in a certain document as that being a valid statement of compliance.
Okay, so that then, thank you, Jonathan. So that's a similar question to David Hillchow at your questions there. We mentioned about the electronic documents, so go and have a look at Schedule 4, that's the requirement. We've got a manufacturer here with a question. We typically typically extend the support life, or does it reduce the cost? Can a manufacturer point to a website where the latest support life can be obtained for the product? So it's a similar kind of thing. So the requirement for software support period, having that online, is that an acceptable way of providing that information?
So I think with this question, there's maybe been a little bit of conflation between the information that has to be included in the statement of compliance and one of the actual security requirements itself. So
Yes.
paragraph 3 of Schedule 1. The actual requirement itself says that the current defined support period has to be published with various caveats around it. Needs to be in an accessible manner, without the provision of prior information, etc. Full details in Schedule 1. The challenge of the defined support period being something which is inherently protean, it can change over time, is something that we have acknowledged in the development of this regime. So if you look at the information that has to be included within the statement of compliance about the defined support period, it makes it clear that the defined support period that is included in the statement of compliance has to be the one that was correct when the manufacturer first supplied the product. If after supplying the product, but before a product is sold to a customer, they have extended the defined support period, that doesn't mean that document, that specific document accompanying that specific product has to be updated.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And it's worth saying as well with the software support period, you mentioned before, Vina, there's a difference there with the ETSI requirements in that there's an end date required on according to the schedule. So that's something that's a key thing that's worth highlighting, I think. Sorry, Vina, I don't know if you want to.
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. Just checking. I had it pulled up here. So the defined support period in the regulations means the minimum length of time expressed as a period of time with an end date for which security updates will be provided.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
That is in the act.
Yeah, yes, that's in the act. So can we send out some links to people can search it up, I guess, but is it in your presentation as well where some of this documentation is that possible? Yeah, perfect. There's one about IT monitoring systems. You've kind of given that one the thumbs up, Jonathan. So it's about IT monitoring systems associated with IoT devices and supervision of those cloud monitoring systems. Are they considered within the scope?
Sorry, just for clarity, where I have thumbs up a question, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm responding in the affirmative. On this specific question, the individual requirements each have their own bespoke hardware and software scopes. If so, just assuming that the extent of a manufacturer's obligations start and end with the, for example, physical product that meets the definition of internet connectable or network connectable product, isn't an interpretation I would advise industry to take to ensure that you're compliant with the full hardware and software scope of the regime. When interpreting how to comply with the requirements, you should look at their bespoke hardware and software scopes. Requirements 2 and 3, for example, extend to software that may never be installed on the device itself, but are used for in connection with the manufacturer's intended purpose for the product. Where those conditions are met, it is foreseeable that the software components of a cloud monitoring system could be something that have to be included within the scope of that requirement. So the vulnerability management process in requirement 2 or the defined support period calculation in requirement 3.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. There's a question, quite a specific question about software updates. There's got to be for a stated period, but there's nothing about the minimum content of the software updates. What is to stop a supplier providing, in essence, blank files? So I guess in essence, not supporting the product in reality. I think part of this is addressed in the requirements in the TS 103701 specification, whereby it checks kind of the content of things that are supplied to the product. But yeah, I guess go on, Jonathan.
So on this point, what I would suggest is what has been outlined there, i.e. updates are being provided, but they don't actually have any meaningful security impact. What I would point to is our definition of defined support period recruits another term we've defined. We've provided the bespoke definition of security updates. And you can see in Regulation 2 of the regulations that a security update has to be a software update that protects or enhances the security of a product. So what I would suggest is in the scenario that's been outlined there, if those updates are not protecting or enhancing the security of the products, they wouldn't be considered to be security updates for the purpose of that requirement.
Perfect. That's all clear. And Jackie, I don't know if I want to put you on the spot, but I guess it's in market surveillance and things like that. Is that something that would be kind of checked as part of that exercise, software updates and things like that, and comparing that with the software updates, or is that something yet to be outlined?
Yeah, I think market surveillance is going to be looking at compliance of all three of the security requirements. So that will be something that we will be looking at. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Right. So next questions. Where are we up to now? And then let me just scroll back down to where let me. So done, Simon. Okay. So we're on to David Hill-Jowett. Why did DSIT only give manufacturers 7 months from enforcement to enable manufacturer start placement of fully compliant products, including the requirement for the SOC to accompany the product onto the market? 7 months from enforcement to enable manufacturer. Okay, so Jonathan.
We didn't. We announced the start of the 12-month implementation period that we committed to on the 29th of April, the year just gone. We published draft versions of the regulations that we were very confident wouldn't change as a result of the processes that they had to go through in order to enter into UK law. They didn't. We told manufacturers that this was the approach and this was the reason why we were confident in starting the 12-month implementation period then. We provided 12 months at least because we have also been clear that we've been going to be mandating these requirements since January 2020.
I mean, I think he specifically referred to perhaps the SOC as part of that, so that might have changed since the initial requirements did it. But yeah, go on, Jonathan.
The requirement for a statement of compliance to accompany a product is set out in the primary legislation. So the drafting of that part of the regime has been in the public domain since late 2021. The provisions in Schedule 4 of the regulations, they align, as we have also committed to previously, as much as possible with existing information that's included within analogous documents and other regimes.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Warder.
Thank you. I was just going to add, in addition to what my colleague Jonathan has mentioned, many manufacturers have kind of outlined that they are going to comply with the CEM provisions that we highlighted earlier on, and that standard was published in 2021. So this information's been out there for a very long time. We've been very clear that from 2018 onwards that these are the baseline security requirements that we're going to mandate. And many manufacturers have already complied. So I think to say that we haven't provided enough time to take action would be a bit unfair.
Yeah, okay, thank you, guys. Next one, is it sufficient? So question, Shiv Albright, about end date of software support period. An end date is required. We discussed that already. Vina's mentioned that. It's very clear in the schedule as well on the documentation. So I think we've covered that one. So you can't just go 3 years from the launch of the module or whatever. I think that devices covered by the legislation should be a product to be sold at the public market. Is that right? So I mean, yeah. So I mean, the ultimate requirement is that they're consumer IoT. How they're placed on the market, is that specified?
So I would encourage the person that asked this question. It seems like the answers that you are seeking will be in the definition of UK consumer connectable product and the definition of supply in the Act, which I believe are sections 55 and 56, but in the 50s.
Okay. So yeah, again, I mean, the general kind of underlying answer is go and have a look at the requirements, which we'll send some links out for. But yeah, it's still good to kind of clarify some of these points. Do the password requirements concern all passwords of the products or only those involving the user via the user interface? Yeah, sorry, go on, Jonathan. I was going to say.
So there are some exemptions to strings of characters that would fall within the common sense understanding of the term password for the purposes of that requirement. They are set out within that schedule. So, for example, a password doesn't include a cryptographic key, a PIN where it is used for pairing in non-IP communication protocols or application program interface keys. But with those exceptions, anything that is a password is within the scope of that.
Perfect. So it's clear what the exceptions are, Didier, and then you can take it from there. So things like Bluetooth pins are fine, but other things you will need to cover. Joe Ryan, will the security requirements be enforced under the current UKCA requirements, or is it standalone? Jonathan?
No, they will not be enforced under the UKCA or CE requirements. That this regime exists entirely in parallel with whatever the government's position is on UKCA CE recognition or the UKCA mark.
Okay, thank you. Rob Pinninger, we just covered that one. Pins, well, pairing pins are not covered. So definition of a password doesn't include pins, he's saying, at least if you take the literal meaning of the wording. Sorry, I've got some things popping up on the screen which are covering the wording. Right, there we go. I've seen different feedback on this. Is there a definitive answer? Is a PIN a password?
We have said everything that is of relevance to interpretation of the regime in terms of whether a certain string of characters is a password or not within the drafting of our regulations and the wider regime. You're not going to hear from me today a specific characterization of a password or a specific string of characters is or isn't a password. We're not in a position actually to offer that opinion ultimately at this point. The way in which we have defined or not defined password for the purposes of the regime is what is in UK law. That is the way in which OPSS as the enforcer is going to be interpreting the regime. It's the way the courts would ultimately be determining whether or not a security requirement has been breached if it ever got to it. So I would encourage organizations that have continued questions about whether a specific aspect of their product falls within the scope of a specific definition in the Act, to consult with their legal advisors about it, because they should be able to offer some insights into what happens with the UK legal system where the government hasn't expressly defined a term and how that is to be interpreted.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. That's clear. Next one from Sergeant Com Floron. What is the criticality level of security flaws included in the PSTI? I don't think that's particularly described in the PSTI, but Jonathan, I want to answer that. Can our commitment duration for resolution be variable depending on the criticality of the reported CV? So this is about vulnerability disclosure policies. And yeah, at what point they have to kind of provide some information on the, can they kind of discount and triage it through a certain level of vulnerability?
So our intention for security requirement 2 is not to commit industry to have to resolve every security issue that is reported to them. There is, I think what this question relates to is the provision that says that information has to be published about when someone who's reported a security issue will receive status updates until the resolution of this reported issue. Our intention with that provision is not to require the resolution of that security issue. And obviously, you can infer from that that criticality also doesn't factor into the absence of that requirement.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I don't know. Yeah, so that's great. So yeah, I mean, in essence, they've got to have a process in place for managing these things and working with the vulnerabilities. But I guess some of the kind of process, some of the kind of details of how that's implemented is then down to the manufacturer.
Yeah, I would just second what Jonathan said, that like we haven't specified every rule or requirement for every part of every process. We've specified the high level requirement that is meeting the intention that we want to achieve, and that is to implement these baseline security measures. So there needs to be an existence of a vulnerability disclosure scheme or policy. It needs to be available to the public. That there are certain conditions that come alongside that, which kind of supplement what is in the ETSI standards. And the best place to look for that, to provide that clarity, is Schedule 1 of the regulations, where there is a section that talks about the passwords, the vulnerability disclosure, and also the length, minimum length of time for security updates. And we don't really go beyond what is in the legislation. So if it's not mentioned in the legislation, then we can't provide a view on it, because that ultimately is down to the manufacturer. And just one of the reasons we've done that is to make sure that, you know, we're not being overly prescriptive, because then we're inadvertently kind of restricting different organizations. So we know that there's lots of different types of IoT products out there. Processes vary. We want it to provide that framework, but all we're mandating is what is in the Act and the regulation. If it's not mentioned, then we can't provide a view on it.
Perfect,
But there
yeah.
is, sorry, one thing to add, that there is a lot of kind of helpful advisory and supporting information on vulnerability disclosure schemes, policies, all this stuff out there. So if people want best practice to sounds like ways to secure the products as far as possible, then we would really welcome that. And there's lots of information out there to kind of supplement the legislation.
Thank you. Yes, ETSI have got guides on meeting the requirements of the TS 103701 standard, which is where the provisions come from, 303645, and also vulnerability disclosure policy guide as well. So yeah, again, if you come to us at SafeShark, we can point you in the direction of those kind of things, because we work on these boards. So we've only got a minute left. So if we didn't get a chance to come to your questions, there was one there about a recording. We'll be sending out the recording of this webinar once we've kind of finished it off and kind of make it ready for sharing. So we'll do that. As I said, Vina's going to be sharing some information that we talked about during this webinar. So thanks very much for your attendance and all your questions, very insightful, and for keeping it within the scope of the product regulation, which is much appreciated. As I said, you can download our guide or visit our website. It gives you some further information. We can we'll take a look at some of the questions we didn't get to, see if we can get you to answers to these offline. Yeah, it's just left for me to thank the speakers. Thanks very much for your expertise and your insights and your information. Much appreciated for taking the time to share this with everyone. We'll get the information out to everyone as soon as we can. But yeah, appreciate your time, and yes, and like I said, please download the guide, and any further questions, let us know on through our website. But yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.